Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about top tips for beginning Latin American research. And we only have our regular show time today, and so it's going to be really difficult for me to do an exhaustive example of Latin American research with all the resources and what's available. So I've kind of put the presentation together like this today. I'm going to talk about what constitutes Latin America. I'm going to talk about just some basic information about getting started in family history, and maybe with a little bit of some nuances as it pertains to Latin American research. And then I'm going to use one Latin American country as an example to show you how to find the information you need for the particular Latin American country that you might be interested in doing research in. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's just talk first about what constitutes Latin America. Latin America is basically Central America, South America, and most of the Caribbean. There's kind of an interesting nuance to this in that there are lots of languages spoken in those countries. Of course, the predominant language is Spanish. Portuguese, however, is also a very big language in South America. French is spoken in some places, Italian in others, and then Latin is not spoken, but a lot of the records that you're going to need to use for genealogy are going to be in Latin. And so that's important to understand. Just because you or your grandparents may speak Spanish doesn't mean that's the only language that you're going to need to have some familiarity with as you dig into some of these genealogical records and start tracing your family tree. So just kind of be aware that there's some language issues that you might encounter, and there's some ways to overcome that. I don't speak, I speak a little French, but other than that, I don't speak those languages, and yet I still manage to do genealogical research in many of those languages, records that contain many of those languages. So let's talk about how to get started first. For some of you, you're brand new to genealogy, and it's never before occurred to you that you even could do genealogy or could build a family tree. And so let me just explain to you where to start. The first place to start is to start with what you know. Now that seems like a really simple, pretty common sense concept, but you'd be surprised how many people try to jump directly to what they don't know. So start with what you know. You're going to want to start by building a family tree. You can do that on Ancestry.com. So you can just come here to Ancestry.com. You have the option, actually if I log out of my account here, you're going to see, if you've never been to our website before, this is what it looks like. You can just start by building a family tree. You're going to want to put in information you know about yourself, your parents, your grandparents. If you're lucky enough to still have your grandparents with you, talk to them, ask them questions. I think sometimes we try to build family trees without doing that crucial step. And we find that we miss out on some of the best resources that we have available. If your grandparents aren't still living, talk to your parents. Ask them about their parents and their grandparents. There's probably a lot that they remember. When you're asking them questions, the kinds of things you want to know are not just what were their names, but when did they die? It's very likely that your parents or grandparents will remember when their parents or grandparents passed away. If they don't remember the exact year, ask them questions like, well, how old were you? Or do you remember what time of year it was? Kind of try to narrow that information down. One of the challenges with Latin American research, which is actually common to British research, is that the names are not, there's not a very big variety of names, right? You're going to have a lot of similar surnames, a lot of similar given names, and so the more information you have, the more likely you are going to be able to tell people of the same name apart, particularly when they're living in the same area and are possibly even first and second and third cousins who've grown up around each other. So the more information that you can gather to begin with, the better off you're going to be. As a matter of fact, not just the better off you're going to be, the more likely you're going to be able to actually build a family tree that's more than just one or two generations. Now, as you're adding your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents to your family tree, Make sure that you also add their children. So you're going to add your brothers and sisters and their kids and grandkids if they have them. You're going to add your aunts and uncles and their children and grandchildren. You're going to do the same thing with your parents' aunts and uncles. Again, the more information you collect, the more likely you are to connect into the correct family. One of the main identifying factors of people is family structure. So if you know that you found a Juan Hidalgo who is living in the specific place and is about this specific age, but he never had children, you're going to be able to tell him apart from the Juan Hidalgo who was your uncle who, had 3 boys and married a woman named Maria. And so the point is, the more you understand about the family, the better. Now, I know for some of you, particularly those of you who come from Catholic families, that's going to be a lot of people, and that's good. That means you're going to get started correctly, and this step may take you a while as you talk to your living grandparents, and if some of you are lucky enough to have great-grandparents, talk to your aunts and uncles, collect all of that information. Ask about family stories. Ask about where the family came from. If you're living here in the United States, ask about when they immigrated. If the family is still living in some of those Latin American countries, ask who's still living there. Like, what cousins do they know that still live there that you could maybe talk to or email, or that you might be able to connect with on Facebook. Again, the more information you get, the better. And one of the benefits of having families still in some of those Latin American countries is that oftentimes they can help you with the research in records that have not yet been digitized and made available online. So that's the big starting point. And again, it's one that so many people rush through in their desire to just dive into digging back through their family tree. But it is the foundational step that makes sure that you're climbing your own family tree and not somebody else's. The next step is you're going to move from the known to the unknown. And again, a lot of times people just want to jump straight to the unknown. Who were my great-grandparents? Well, what do you know about them? I don't know anything about them. Okay, well, then we need to talk about your grandparents, right? You have to start with what you know and then move to what you don't know. And so once you get this family tree built, let's say you've talked to your grandmother and she's given you all of the information that she can about her parents. Well, take that information and go looking for records that include the information that she's shared with you. So the kinds of records that most genealogists start with are birth, marriage, and death records, census records, military records, and immigration records. Those are kind of the foundational record sets for genealogy research. And they are available for most Latin American countries. And so those are the kinds of records that you're going to want to start looking for. Maybe ask Grandma, does she have a copy of her parents' death certificates? Does she have a copy of her parents' marriage certificate? The reason that is important is because oftentimes those records will contain additional information. So for example, a death certificate very often will list a birth date and place, parents' names, and sometimes even the parents' birthplace. And so you start to just connect the generations and track your way back one generation at a time. So you want to start looking for records for people that you know about, that you have in your tree, to connect them with people that you can add to your tree or that you know little about, and then do the same for that generation, just one generation at a time. Now, Latin American research, particularly if you do not live in Latin America, there are some things that you need to do. And this is the same for anybody. It doesn't matter if you're doing research in Eastern Europe, if you're doing research in Britain, if you're doing research in Australia, Canada, whatever. If you are doing research in a new location to you, so I do this if I'm doing research in Tennessee or North Carolina, right? The more you can learn about that place, the more likely you are to be successful in locating records, and the more likely you are to be able to make sure that you're identifying the correct people in those records and not attaching the wrong people to your family tree. So with Latin American research, I would encourage you strongly to learn more about the geography, the history, and the language of your ancestors. So one of the first things that I do whenever I'm doing research in a new language is I create a list of genealogy keywords in that language. So let me just show you how I do that. One of my favorite tools is Google Translate. So if you just go to translate.google.com, and if you don't speak the language, then this is really useful. And so then I might type in a list of genealogical keywords, okay? Born, birth, christening, married, marriage, spouse, husband, wife, dead, death, burial, just any of those kinds of words, right? Father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, sister, brother, cousin, right? Just create a whole list of words, and then over here you can actually just tell Google Translate what language you want those words to be in. So if I was interested in Spanish, I could say show me those words in Spanish, or in Italian, or even in Latin. You can see I've got that. Here is one of my often used languages, because when you're looking at records, you don't have to be able to speak the language, but you do need to be able to recognize some of these key words and phrases so that you can know what it is that you're looking at on the record, so that you know what it is that it means. I also do this if I find a record and it has information on it and I don't know what it means. I'll just come in here, type in that language, and then translate it into English to get a rough idea. It's not always a perfect translation, but it gives me a rough idea of what it is that I'm dealing with. So here you can see, here's my list of words, and then I can just take this list of words and print it out on a little piece of paper, stick that little piece of paper right next to my computer screen, so as I do work in these records, I know what kinds of keywords I should be looking for to help pull the information out of the record. So Google Translate is a really excellent resource for doing the kind of genealogy work that you need to do if you do not speak the language. So if your family spoke Spanish or Portuguese or French, if the records are in Latin, it works regardless, okay? Then the next thing that I pay attention to, and again, I do this whether I'm doing research here in the United States or in whatever country, is I want to learn more about who governed that location at different times in history. That's important for a lot of reasons. One reason is, for example, many of the records for Latin America, many of those countries were at one time governed by the country of Spain. And so therefore, some of the national records of those countries are actually held by the National Archives of Spain, in Spain. Right? So just because a record was created in Mexico and is about the Mexican people, if it was created during a time when Spain governed that country, it's very possible that those records were actually taken back to Spain, or copies were sent to the National Archives in Spain. Same is true with France, same is true with Portugal, right? So depending on who governed the country at the time the record was created. Now, it's just important just to kind of understand what that timeline is. It also means that if and when the country gained independence, that is a good clue about when that country, the National Archives in that country, will start having consistent records for that location. So learn about the history of the governance of the country in order to understand where the records were created, where the records are housed today. And then that leads us just really nicely, and you can do some of this stuff with just a simple Google search, and I'll show you here, like I said, using Mexico or as an example, I will show you just how I discovered some of this information, and then you can apply that same concept to whatever country it is that you're interested in. The next step then, of course, is to research what records exist and where you can find them. So there are actually a lot of records available. Some of them are it's actually possible to go further back in Latin American records than it is to go back in U.S. records in some cases. And so really excellent records, really rich resources available. But you need to know what exists and where you can find those particular records. And so let's just look at an example. I told you we're going to use one country as an example because we don't have time to go over every country in Latin America. And so I'm going to use Mexico just because it's our closest neighbor and probably most applicable to most of you who are watching this particular presentation at this time. And we'll just talk about some of the records that are available for Mexico and how I discovered that, okay? So, first off, as genealogists, oftentimes our brain automatically goes to the census. And so I just Googled Mexico census just to see what I could learn about what came up. And here are some of the things that I learned. The earliest Mexican census was actually taken in 1689 by the Spanish government. And that particular census is actually held by the Spanish government in Spain. And so you can go there and at the National Archives view a copy of that. Now, in 1868 and 1878, the Mexican government attempted to take a census. However, there was a lot of suspicion by the people. They were concerned about increased taxation. They were concerned about government action. And so those censuses are really incomplete because the people were nervous about it. And so they would hide from the enumerators or not give information or give inaccurate information. And those two censuses are actually held in the Mexican National Archives. Finally, in about 1895, the government managed to take a fairly comprehensive census. And so then in 1900, and then every 10 years thereafter, they've been able to, much like the United States does, take a fairly decent census of the people. The 1930 census is bolded here because it is actually available online at Ancestry.com. So let me sign back into my account here. And let me show you where you're going to find that. I would imagine that if you're doing research in Mexico, most of you are able to get enough information that you can get back to 1930. So maybe you still have a parent or grandparent who's living who was alive in 1930, or at the very least, you have a parent or grandparent who can tell you about their parents or grandparents who may have been living in Mexico in 1930. So I'm going to hover over search and just go down here to the card catalog. And then over here on the left-hand side, as soon as these filters load, I'm going to be able to just scroll down here to location, click on Mexico, and you're going to see we have a few databases that have records of people from Mexico. One of the biggest here, of course, is this 12.8 million Mexico National Census. Now, it is in Spanish, right? Ancestry.com indexes records, but translating them is a little bit trickier. Like any other census on Ancestry.com, if you've used them before, there is a browse box over here. So if you happen to know where your family lived, you can go directly to the state and then to the particular town or municipality, and then down to the specific city, and that will take you to a set of images. In this case, there's only one of them that lists the people who were living in that particular location. If there were more, if there were more images in this batch, you could just use these little arrows down here at the bottom and arrow your way through the 10 or 15 or 20 images that are included. Now, one of the things, again, that you may notice is that this is in Spanish. And so the headings on this collection are all in Spanish. So again, what I might do here, if I didn't know the language or wasn't as familiar with it, I might just come in and type some of these words or phrases into Google Translate so that I knew what each of these fields meant. In this case, there's some information about the household, the name of the person, the gender. Over here, there's information about their marital status, and it looks like they've got quite a few categories for that. Information about professions and occupations, just lots of really good information. One of the things that I appreciate about the Mexico census, much like the Canadian census, is it also lists religion. And that becomes important because in Mexico, one of the best records available are the church records. So most of the population, of course, is Catholic, but not all of the population. And so knowing whether your family was Catholic or not is important so that you know what records to go to next. So it includes, in the very last column back there, religion as well. So this 1930 Mexico census, again, you can browse it like I just showed you here. Just go if you know exactly where your family lived, and that's important because one of the things is as digital genealogists that we tend to get stuck in, the trap we tend to get stuck in, is we just type a name into a box and we expect that that's going to give us exactly what we want, and then we look at exactly what we want and we move on. The problem is we lose context when we do that. We don't pay attention to the other people listed on the page or the people who might be listed the page before or the page after. And very often people in our families lived in the same communities. So you may find your mother's family and your father's family living a few houses away from one another. That context tells a story. It explains a little bit more about how they met. Or you might find your father's family and your mother's aunt and uncle living next door to each other, even though your mother lived 3 towns away, right? So that, again, pay attention to records in context, which is why I love to use this browse box where possible and not jump directly to searching these particular records. So that's the 1930 Mexico census. Excellent, excellent resource to get you started. Provides some really, really rich information, and a lot of times you'll see very large family groups. I was actually looking at one this morning, I should have saved it on the screen for you, where there were actually 4 generations of a family living in the household. And so there was a bunch of children, their parents, the grandparents, and then there was a 105-year-old great-grandmother living in the household as well. And so that's really exciting when you can see those kinds of family groupings in these particular records. Now, civil registration. Civil registration means government registration of birth, marriage, and death records. Civil registration in Mexico, and this is how I found this out. I just Googled Mexico civil registration. So again, you can do this for any country. Venezuela, civil registration. Brazil, civil registration, right? That's the key phrase that you're looking for if you want to understand or learn about when they started keeping these records. So Mexico started keeping civil registration in 1859. However, from 1859 to 1867, remember they had those problems with the census in 1868, 1878, the people were really suspicious of the government and of what the government was trying to do, and it was a new thing, and they already had their births and their christenings and their marriages and their burials recorded in church records, and so why did they also need to record them in government records? So from 1859 to 1867, there are records that exist, but they're super, super spotty, right? So your person, your ancestor may or may not, more likely may not, have been recorded in those particular records during that time period. However, from 1867 to the present, those records are pretty complete, which means if a person was born, married, or died in Mexico, chances are from 1867, their birth, marriage, or death would have been recorded. Now, one of the great things about Latin American research, which we do not have as much of here in the United States, is church records. Because of the predominant religion in the country of Mexico, you're going to have additional records and sometimes more complete records available from the local churches than you do from the federal government. So civil registration records birth, marriage, and death. Church records record christening, right, which also sometimes includes a birth date. So a child could be christened right after they were born, or they could be christened when they were, 2.5 years old, right? The father just decided to take, all 3 of the children down and have them all christened at the same time. And so you may see groups of families or groups of children christened together. So church handles christening, where the government handles birth. Both record marriages, so there will be a marriage recorded in the church as well as in the civil registration after 1867. And then churches record burials. So where the civil registration records a death, the church will record a burial, and that's because, particularly in the Catholic religion, people were buried on church grounds. The Catholic religion believes in the consecration or the holiness of that of that ground that people are buried in. And so the church would record who was buried and who was not. Now, what that means is that if for some reason your ancestor was not christened or baptized, then they could not be buried in the churchyard. And so understanding the nuances of, again, who was and who was not part of the Catholic religion in your family will help you understand what records were created and what circumstances in their lives led to certain records being created so that you know where to find them. And again, I located that by just typing in Mexico church records. Now, here's the really cool thing about church records. Like I mentioned, they're a lot more complete. And so so there are records that begin as early as 1527 for Mexico, because they were recorded by the local church. And most often, those records are recorded at a parish level, and then copies of those records are sent to the diocese. And so those records are held then by the diocese for that particular area. So understanding what diocese exist in the place where your ancestor lived will help you know when they started keeping records for that location. And then it'll also help you understand where those records are. A lot of them have diocesan, I can't ever say that word. They'll have archives at a diocese level, and that's where those records are going to be available. And so it might require a little letter writing campaign or a little bit of Googling to see if there's somebody that you can call, or if you don't speak the language, again, you can use Google Translate. Put in a simple email into that translate box, translate it into the language, and then email or mail it off to the people that you are interested in. Now, again, using Mexico as an example, there is a beginner's guide. George and Peggy Rice-Camp are probably the preeminent Mexican family historians, genealogists, and they have written a book called Finding Your Mexican Ancestors. And you can go purchase that book, and they give you a lot more detail than I had time to give you here. A lot more detail about where records are held, where you can access them, if they've been microfilmed or not, and if those records have been microfilmed, particularly those church records, you can go to a local family history center in your area and order that microfilm from the Family History Library. It'll be sent to your location. A copy of it will be sent to your location, and then you can look through those church records or those civil registration records on microfilm in wherever it is that you are. Now, there are not just Mexican, but a lot of Latin American records that are going to be coming online in the next few months. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're not familiar with this, to pay attention to not just the card catalog, but also this What's Happening at Ancestry.com box here on the home page. Just keep track here or pay attention here to what new records Ancestry.com is putting online, and as new records become available digitally, we update this particular list so that you can see what's happening. Also, you're going to want to become familiar with the card catalog if you're not already. Again, you hover over search, click on card catalog, and then over here on the left-hand side, you can use these filters: North America, South America. Mexico is actually broken out, even though it is technically part of North America. You can get to it either way. And then as new databases or new records become available, there will be additional countries listed so that you can see what else is available for those particular locations. So become familiar with the card catalog, become familiar with the What's Happening at Ancestry.com new records list, and as new records come online, that's fabulous, and you'll have access to them that way. But also recognize that for many Latin American countries, some of those records are going to have to come from family sources. Talk to your family, and they're going to sometimes require you to order microfilm, and sometimes require you to actually write to the church or to the parish where your family came from to see if there is additional information there. Of course, the bonus is always if you can find a cousin living there that you can communicate with via email or on Facebook, that can actually go into that place and look at those records in person, most often in a language that is native to them, or with the help of a priest who speaks the Latin that the records might be recorded in. That's going to be your best bet. Lots more we could have covered, but we are out of time. So hopefully this has just been information enough to kind of to help you see the possibilities, to get your taste buds a little bit wet for what is possible to do with Latin American research. I have several friends who do this research both professionally and for their own families, and have just been amazed at the success that they have, and a little bit jealous because, like I said, some of those Catholic Church records go back so much further and are such better documentation than what I even have available for my family here in the United States. So, hope that was useful information. If you're watching this live, I will be on chat in just a few minutes to answer any questions you might have. If you're watching an archived version of this on YouTube, just leave a question there in the comments. I do monitor those and will respond as necessary. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.